It used to be that the collection of the data and the processing of the data were like the crucial components to get insights. But now, we also need to include visualization in the process. Visualization isn't there just for art or to make us happy. It helps us actually discover things about our data. Perhaps one of the first historical visualizations that was used to do something other than, art is John Snow's map of the cholera outbreak in London in 1854. Basically what was happening is that, well, there was an outbreak of cholera and people were dying and nobody knew why. I mean, yes, they died because they had cholera, but why is it that they're dying in specific spots and not other spots? So what John Snow did, it's a very simple visualization. There was a map of London with little streets, and you see like a number of streets here and there. He decided to plot the locations where people resided that died from the cholera. So all of these little squares, black squares here, represent residences of people who passed away from the outbreak in a specific neighborhood. And if you look at this, you might be thinking, well, hang on, there's barely any black squares in the bottom left corner, top left, top right, bottom right. They all seem to be in the central area, and there seems to be a preponderance of the squares right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. So like, all right, well, that's a little strange that there would be clusters here. Let's see if we can match what we're seeing on the map with the reality on the terrain, so to speak, in the field. And as it happens, here was a public water fountain. And this map was actually used very simply here to get people to realize that the outbreak was being spread by a public fountain. Once the fountain was closed, a number of cases went away. And now we understand how cholera gets spread as a result. Now you might say, hang on. The map didn't tell us how cholera gets spread. It just provided us with a hint, a suggestion to look at other factors to try to determine what is happening. And this is the hallmark of great visualizations. Great visualizations can never prove or explain anything. What they can do is provide you with hints, provide you with suggestions, get the wheels turning, so then you can look at the data and the situation from different angles to try to get to the bottom of a situation. Okay? It's a very, very simple map here. There's nothing very complicated about this. Somebody just plotted the residences of people who were passing away from cholera. And then they noticed a concentration near one of the water fountains. And that triggered an actual understanding of the disease and the spread of the disease. Nowadays, modern age, visualization is often called infographics. So our position is that there's two types of visualizations. There are the infographics and the data visualizations per se. So in both instances here, these are meant to be nouns. Well, what's the difference? An infographic is usually something which is created for a storytelling purpose. But it's created for storytelling purposes in what we think of as a subjective manner. It is usually intended for a very specific audience. This is something else we'll talk about when we talk about storytelling. You need the ability to identify your audience. Who is it that you want to actually share the story with? In an ideal world, you'd be sharing it with everybody. But when you share with everybody, when you're working with a general audience, it limits your ability to incorporate very specific items in it. When you speak to a smaller audience, when you're telling the story to a smaller audience, your team, your immediate team, for instance, or your supervisor or your division, well, there's a, comment je dirais ça en anglais, une communauté d'entendement, a community of understanding. You share jargon. you share conceptual understanding, you are working on the same data sets or on similar situations, you can get away with shortcuts because everybody in your intended audience understands what you're trying to say. Infographics tend to be self-contained. They are discrete. By that I mean that they tell the whole story on their own. They don't really need a second, third, fourth, fifth visualization, a bunch of tables, and then a document about thick for you to get the full context. In infographics, the graphic design aspect is key. So graphic designers are usually working hand in hand with analysts to try to produce charts that are appealing to humans using graphic design principles. But one of the drawbacks of infographics, bringing in outsiders or bringing in graphic designers to produce something which is appealing, typically mean that you cannot reuse the chart with another data set. Very often, you'll find that infographics incorporate unquantifiable information. If you look at a chart and you have a hard time imagining what the data set underneath it looks like, you're probably working with an infographic. Here's an example of an infographic. I'm going to ask you to take a few seconds to look at this chart here. It seems as though we're trying to tell people, potential audience, trying to sell them like a behavioral change. If you do these things, you will be successful. If you do these things, you will be unsuccessful. Why don't you do these things instead? So there is an audience here, an audience potentially of people who want self-help. And now we say self-help and it sounds like it could be negative. It's not necessarily negative, like, it could be a good message. But it's a little bit difficult for me to understand or imagine what the quantifiable data underneath this chart is. Take a look at this a little bit. We have traits, personality traits or personality approaches. Like, look, for instance, if I see have a sense of gratitude will lead you to be successful. Is that what it says? There's a link, there's an association, there's a correlation between people who are successful and people who have a sense of gratitude. There isn't necessarily a causal relationship. Having a sense of gratitude doesn't necessarily cause you to be successful. But this chart is somehow giving you the idea that if you could change your behavior, if you could go from having a sense of entitlement, the corresponding thing on the unsuccessful side, to having a sense of gratitude, then you might become a successful person. Now, if you've seen me give this talk at the ACFO Data Day, you've seen me talk about this chart. Another issue, another difficult thing to quantify is, how do you measure success? Is this success label in a data set of people given, is the success label given by an external observer? Is this something that is self-labeled? How do you measure success? Is this obvious from the infographic in the data set? This infographic is massaging the data a little bit to convey a story. This is great, we want to convey stories, but the story is not necessarily supported or backed by data. Okay? So in general, infographics are a little iffier than visualizations. You are, I believe, better off to convey your message by using data visualizations instead of infographics. In data visualizations, there we're talking about a method as well as an actual item, a thing, a display. So we tend to think of those as being more objective. Now understand, when we say objective, we don't mean that the data underneath the visualization is better somehow than the data underneath infographics. It just means that the method is measurable. You focus more on quantifiable items, on items that can be measured, on items that can be verified, validated. A nice thing about data visualizations methods is, well, you can usually generate your visualizations automatically. Feed in the data set, if it's in the right format, poof, you'll get something. And it can be reused with different data sets. This visualization here basically tells us something about the level of wealth in various states of the United States and various regions, sub-regions, countries. You can imagine doing the same thing with Canadian provinces, or Canadian census metropolitan areas, or European countries, or African countries. It's not just specific to the United States. The look and the feel are less important, although it's quite important to keep aesthetic levels up. It's not as important as the insights that are conveyed by the data. So we typically sacrifice a little bit on style to focus more on the content. And we have to do this sacrifice because if the visualizations can be generated automatically with different data sets and different elements in there, we can't have a one-size-fits-all that works great all the time. Right? Whereas with infographics, we are designing the layout, the look specifically for that situation, so we can spend more time working on the actual design. One nice thing about visualizations as well, you can usually guess what the data set would be. So take a quick look at this visualization here. Later on, we'll talk about why pie charts are probably not a good choice chart, but it's still a decent visualization. Can you tell me what the underlying data set would consist of? Can you figure out what the variables would need to be and what the observations would need to be? You're seeing that the size represents the population of the state, right? So the size of the chunk tells you how populous the state is. So California is a populous state, the most populous state. It has the largest angle. Texas is another big state. Florida is big. New York is big. Whereas some of the smaller ones, what are we seeing that's smaller here? Like Alabama is pretty small. Wisconsin is not that big. Each state is there in the data set, and one of the measurements we have for each state is its population. The population is given by the arc length. There's other things as well. We see a hierarchical structure. For instance, we can tell that Alabama here, Alabama is part of the southern region, east-south. So we not only have the state, but we have the sub-region in which the state is found. And this east-south and west-south are both part of, together with the South Atlantic, are all part of a region called the South. So we have, with each state is sub-region membership, its region membership as well, its population. And there's one other element, which is the color. And the color measures, according to this little legend here, the income, whether a state is low income or high income. So we should have a low-high variable as well. So we see it's not that complicated. We have 50 observations and we have 5 measurements. Sub-region, the state, the sub-region, the region, the population. There might have been other things in that data set, and this is just, we also decided to use, we only decided to use these variables to come up with the visualization. A nice thing about data visualization is not only are you able to take a guess as to what the underlying data set would look like, what the structure would look like, but you can also fairly easily identify points or things that are fishy, unlikely to make sense. I'm going to ask you, for instance, by looking at the color scheme which is here. Blue is meant to represent low-income states, and orange is meant to represent high-income states. Now, you are not blind, you are not naive when it comes to the United States. You have some understanding of the United States. Does it seem likely to you that blue indeed matches low-income states and orange matches high-income states? Based on your understanding of the United States, let's take a state like, I don't know, New York. Where's New York right now? It's right here. Does New York strike you as a low-income state or high-income state? We're expecting it to be high-income because of Manhattan, but who knows what's happening in Binghamton or Albany or any of these other places. Buffalo might not be the highest income city in the nation, But Manhattan would probably sort of draw a fair amount of income to be high. What about if I look at a place like Alabama? Does Alabama strike you, based on your conceptual understanding, as a high-income place or a low-income place? Perhaps using median household income as our measurement for income, there's something weird with this. But a good data visualization will allow you to look at this and think to yourself, that's odd. That is not what I would expect to see. So if you're able to do this, it probably means that you're working with a visualization, because either somebody made a coding mistake. It's quite conceivable that along the way the high and the low got flipped. A visualization would allow you to discover that. That's a positive in its favor. But it could also mean that your understanding of the situation was flawed, and a good visualization will allow you to come to a better understanding of the situation that is being represented by the data. Now, when you work with the same data sets over and over and over again, which I suspect some of you are, it's easy to sort of forget that some people don't know the data. It's easy to become blind to the data set's weak spots. Visualizations allow you to see the data set from different angles. It might also, apart from being able to help you convey a message, it might make you realize that you're not seeing the data set in the right manner. It can be a transformative experience for the producer of the visualization. Okay, this is going to be the extent to which we're going to talk about data visualization in general. I have a few other slides that talk about what the difference between using data in the 20th century and the 21st century. I'm not going to focus too much on these things. The one big difference is that now that we have access to digital machines that can, store data, a lot of data, and process it quickly, data visualization has become part of the analytical landscape. It used to be not the case. Visualization wasn't really part of it. We would design experiments, collect data, and try to validate our theories from the experiments that we've designed and the data we've collected. Now, we just collect a lot of data, not necessarily by design. We observe data, and we can use data visualization to help inform what our hypotheses would be. Try to find things that make no sense. So I'm going to skip over some of those, take a look at it when you have some chance to do so.